Thanks so much for tuning into BQ Conversations. I'm your host, Neeraj Shah, and the conversation today is a special one. Every time I speak to Dr. Amit Varma, I learn over those 30 minutes, and then I hear the conversation again, and then I decide that there are a few more things that I would want to ask him the next time that I talk to him. This is our third conversation, and look forward to this with as much expectation as the previous ones. Dr. Varma, good having you. Thanks for joining in.
Thank you for the build-up and also the pressure to make sure that I do the right thing.
I'm sure you will. The question is, how much can we cover in the stipulated 20 to 25 minutes? Let me start off with something that we had spoken about in our first conversation, Dr. Verma, that you had mentioned then that in a post-pandemic world, while the world was obsessed back then with what was happening around the pandemic, the world was, or India and some other countries were not quite looking at the chronic ailments. They had been pushed to the back burner, but doesn't mean that they were not there. And when they come back, they'll come back with a vengeance. And that would lead to, I mean, from a business perspective, a lot of business for companies notwithstanding, it could be a serious hazard as well. How have you observed the last 18 months? And now that we seem to be in a post-pandemic world, and what does this lead you to believe about the next 18 to 24 months?
So, Neeraj, as we discussed earlier, unfortunately, it took a COVID to highlight the great scarcity of resources and infrastructure that we have in the current scenario of healthcare. Not just in India, it's across emerging. And I guess I should point out that there's not a single country which came out covering itself with glory during this period. However, for India and emerging Asia, it is a much larger issue. The main issue that we are seeing is that there seems to be the resurgence of chronic diseases because people were not getting diagnosed, and unfortunately now they're coming back to get diagnosed, but at a much later stage. I think at the cost of now looking at the positives, two important things have taken place due to COVID. The first one is technology interventions, and clearly people have gotten very, very conversant and cognizant of technology being part of medical care. So whether it is related to telemedicine, point of care diagnostics, but this phenomenon is reasonably urban centric. And then there has also been a policy tailwind. So you have federal and state governments beginning to look at policy to deliver innovation and to provide public health insurance with a lot more urgency. But that still leaves us with huge challenges in India. And I think the first one continues to be the low willingness to pay. So people want the best possible care at the least possible price. And somewhere I do believe that there is a drop off of patients when it comes to chronic diseases. So I would still say 60% of patients are not following through with the chronic disease management or following through with things like their medications or getting tests done. The thing that we also need to do, which we're not doing right in India, is creating treatment protocols. And that is something which is very well developed in the developed world. And that's because of the standards of care. And also, more importantly, the insurance demanding that there is standardization. In India, it is still very subjective and it depends on who you go to. And the last is to bring in some kind of a genericization, and I'm creating a new word, of how we treat these services. Because at the end of the day, whatever we do, we need to make it more generic as we go forward. Because the paying patients, which is still which is about 70% of the market still, in spite of widespread public and private insurance, will continue to suffer. So to me, movement towards optimal healthcare by making it standardized, reproducible, and more importantly, that you can replicate is going to be the key.
Okay. How does India do that? Because just the vast mass and the various public welfare programs where monies have to be spent would mean that even for the next 15 years, if we were to invest money, it would still be suboptimal compared to the needs.
I think COVID has provided a positive fillip to investments in the sector. And whether the government, which is a bit more constrained on how much they can spend in the order of priorities, private sector is stepping up to the plate and is starting to look at more and more innovative models. Now, these models, for the first time, I'm beginning to see are a lot more patient centric and are targeted. And so that the products that we are also delivering are now providing to fill up to capacity. It is bringing efficiency in the way we provide it. And also interesting one, which took place, which nobody had ever thought of, including myself, that while there has been a lot of focus on the front end, which is services and making sure doctors getting nurses and technicians, for the first time, we are beginning at optimizing the whole supply chain at the back. Because as the lockdown happened, we were never prepared for service, for equipment or medicines or consumables not to be provided. And I'm beginning to now see a lot of models which are resilient, optimizing the supply side, and actually looking at the rural and the tier 2 and tier 3 markets. That to me is interesting. Now, the second part is that almost, I would say, 5 billion of investments have gone in the private healthcare space through PE, VC. And I'm just giving you some broad numbers. Please don't hold me to it. But I would say about 2.5 billion has gone into the pharma sector, mainly API and chemicals. About a billion and a half has gone into the health tech side, mainly in e-pharmacies, which you've been reading about, and booking platforms. So the patient aggregator models. There's about 800 million to about a billion, which has gone into services, which is mainly into diagnostics and creating networks and platforms. And there's another approximately 200 million, which has gone into others. So talking about this, it is significant because now we have raised scale and size. As you rightly pointed out, a lot more needs to be done. But if there were some broad themes that I'm beginning to look at post-COVID is that there is consolidation, which is leading to scale. So people have realized that to survive any these kind of black swan events, you will need to have a certain scale and size. There is now generation of demand through newer models. So people were not even aware that they needed these services, and that is happening. There are niche specialty plays, not just in services, but also in pharma. So specialization is becoming very important. Out of hospital formats is becoming more and more prominent. We need to get better at keeping people out of the hospital rather than making them patients. And lastly, to me, in any field, whether it is consumables, diagnostics, hospitals, pharma, it is all about creating platforms and synergy, which then create supply chain efficiency.
Okay, let me try and tackle 2 or 3 of these, and you can even come in with something that I may have missed out, right? But the first part which you mentioned, that consolidation, and you see that happening. Now we've seen we kind of partly seen that happening both in the hospital space and the diagnostic space. I reckon in pharmacy as well. Do you reckon this will pick up pace? One, and now if I can get in an investment angle out here as well, Dr. Varma, I mean, who wins? Because in some cases, people would think, like for example, in diagnostics, that people may not have thought of it that way, but is it a race to the bottom in terms of pricing, and therefore do the incumbents benefit? Do they survive merely, or do they thrive in the longer run after going through a bit of a grind? Similarly, in hospitals, what could happen thereof? And I mean, e-pharmacies is anybody's guess. Would love to understand your views here.
I mean, let's start with using maybe the diagnostic market as an example, and then we can always diversify into others. From my perspective, diagnostics is going through a tectonic shift. There is a fundamental change in how diagnostics are being done in India. And basically now it is always been through financial metrics like high ROCs and underpenetration, so fragmented nature of the market. All the players put together are not even double digits of the market. There's a whole new dynamic that is being played around pricing and convenience. So that's where the digital platforms have come in, where they are basically saying that we are demand aggregators. So we'll basically bring in the patients and put it together, and there is a bit of a price fight to the bottom. That said, what most people don't understand and realize about this business, that this is very operationally heavy. This is not just about bringing patients onto the platform. This is not just about the ability of putting a test through a certain machine. It also requires a lot of science, and most importantly, requires a lot of interpretation. So, to my mind, unless players do not pay attention to the back end services and logistics, so convenience, turnaround times, and not just focus on pricing, things may end up as a very short honeymoon for some. Having said that, I see two shifts taking place. You will have the large established players with large networks, reach, and cost of efficiency, leading to middle pricing. And then you have the new age guys, all digital, aggregating it together, don't care where they're doing the testing. That's also needed in our country to reach scale and size. But at some point of time, these worlds will be very different. And you take the same example in pharmacies. You have the lakhs and lakhs of mom and pop shops, and you have the larger players who are aggregating. Clearly, their buying efficiency is going to be of a different level. More importantly, thanks to also digital technology, they're able to deliver to your home. So the convenience and the pricing that they do is very different. So yes, I still trust my neighborhood chemist, but at the end of the day, I think it's going to be a very unequal battle.
Okay. May I request Dr. Varma for you to hypothesize that in a scenario like this, both for pharmacies and diagnostics, the incumbents, as you said, don't even add up to double digit. So they may be large, but they are not really very large. And a couple of people who are coming at the top end, not really the mom and pop size, but the top end, are actually supposedly large players, right? Be it in diagnostics, whether it's the Adani Group or Tata 1mg, or in the pharmacy space, the names are well known. These are not small players. My question is this market wide enough for the incumbents and the larger behemoths who are making an attack, all of them to survive? Or is that debate still open?
We are far away from a shakedown, Neeraj. We are such a large country with such inequality across regions that there is ample scope for growth, at least over the next decade, for anybody who's out there. The problem that arises is that people start to fight on price in lucrative circles. So the west of India, the south of India, some parts of North India, ignoring east, for example. I do believe that with the scales of economy and the masses that we are able to treat, it will force incumbents to start looking at areas which are underpenetrated to create their own heft. So I am beginning to see the amount of investments taking place in the eastern part of India, for example, or going vertical in the lucrative parts in the west and south. So to me, I am less stressed right now about competition. I think more the players, the better. We are far away from a telecom type consolidation scenario where only 3 or 4 are going to survive. There is still a long way to go before we see that.
Got it. Dr. Varma, may I ask, do you have investments in the Indian landscape in either of these two pockets? Why or why not?
Actually, as you may know, that we have two platforms. One is in Quadria, which is the larger platform, and the other is HealthCord, which is in the early stage and venture. And through HealthCord, we have investments already in the diagnostic business in the digital area. So Redcliffe, for example, is one of our investments.
Okay, fair. So so you're kind of going down that route. You don't quite see the value, if I may ask, in the non-digital current brick and mortar diagnostic pocket.
I am a big fan of brick and mortar. I'm a big fan of, I used to run SRL a long time ago. So I believe in the model completely. What I don't believe in is the valuation ask that most of these people have. And for me, that doesn't work. I love the models. I love what can be done. And I see the scale and size and opportunity, but the valuations need to be a bit more pragmatic and real.
Got it. Okay, Dr. Varma, one question on APIs with the policy. I mean, and I think that the country took note of that rather than be dependent on China forever. Let's kind of roll out some policies around the APIs because they'll be critical, inputs into key drugs. The PLI scheme is out there, but when I speak to companies, they're not quite gung-ho currently of, I mean, they are saying that the business would continue, right? And Laurus Labs, when you talk to them, they talk about the business continuing, but can pricing come back for them to make normalized profits, which they were used to? There, the answer is fuzzy at best and negative in the best case in a normalized scenario. So what's your sense about how does that space evolve from where it is right now to where it could be?
So I'm going to be a bit contrarian to the usual view. And my belief here is that the talk and action around rebuilding the resilience around API will yield positive results in the short to medium term future. Again, whenever you do business in India, you need to be patient, you need to be pragmatic, and you need to understand that just because there is theory, the conversion to practical will take some time. So I'm bullish about and optimistic about that there will be changes. There is a strong tailwind around global push to move dependence from China. And the obvious benefactor of that is going to be India for a host of reasons. Just our maturity, the number of FD approved plants, the technology, and more importantly, the skill set that we have. So, to my mind, the wider success will depend on a few factors. The first will be our ability to manufacture at scale to become globally competitive. So, it's very fashionable for India to compare itself to China, but sometimes one is dwarfed by their ability to create and what our ability is. I think the second, which is very important, is the strong upstream presence to lower the dependence on China for starting materials. So there needs to be now the ability for the KSMs to move up and down. And lastly, where we have failed because we've taken the easy way out is to make very simple molecules. To me, the key, and I recently spoke at the IDMA, is that manufacturers in India need to start going up the value chain. We need to create more and more complex APIs. We need to get more and more specialized because that's where the fruit is. It's not creating the aspirins of the world. Anybody can do it. But when we get into more specialized and complex, for which, by the way, I believe India is very well positioned, we should be able to get past this hump.
Okay. You don't see telltale evidence of companies doing that meaningfully? Maybe one or two stray examples.
I would say that at least the companies, we have been fans of API because before API became fashionable. So we made our investments, for example, in things like Concord Biotech a long time ago. The logic for that was very simple, that they were using a technology like fermentation, which very few people can do. And we were in the space of immunosuppressants and transplant medication, which is specialized. So that's the thesis of why we like to be in specialized businesses, regardless of whatever we do.
Okay. I've taken 20 minutes. I'll take 5 more, Dr. Varma, with your consent. Okay.
Sure.
Thank you. So the CDMO space, and you have an investment in one of the largest CDMO companies, not listed, I presume, not listed as yet. But we've seen commentary or performance from some of the other players as well, at least the ones which are listed, whose finances we get access to, where the CDMO side of the business is starting to now show scale, skin, performance. What's your sense on how Indian companies are approaching this and where it could be a few quarters down the line?
See, we were very lucky, Neeraj, that we saw the trend in CDMO a few years earlier. And we started to build a thesis around why we think that CDMO could do very well in India. This trend has been in vogue for some time now, but as per our assessment, the significant portion of profit pool will shift upwards towards manufacturing and CDMO. And because it will move into manufacturing, CDMO is going to benefit from it. That is a clear trend. So there will be more manufacturing and CDMO will benefit. And again, players who either provide scale, like in Akums that we are invested in, where almost 15% of medicines made in India are made by Akums, or again, there is advanced niche technologies available to do specialized CDMO, is going to differentiate the bread from the butter. I also think that India will have the advantage of offering CDMO both for domestic and international markets, which very few countries can do. So again, it harks back to the quality of our production, the FDA affiliated factories, all of those will play a role. And I think if you ask me, the breakout for me in the next couple of years in the CDMO space is basically going to be in the biologics, biosimilars, and the med device.
Oh, interesting. What's your view there? By the way, the last time you had a fairly a different view, if I'm not wrong, on the biosimilar space and the kind of growth that it can show versus the hurdles that it faces. What's your sense
I
there?
still think it's an uphill challenge, but
Okay.
I am beginning to see shoots of green because we are beginning to see some very good specialized, smaller size companies who, instead of trying to do too much, are staying focused to the areas of strength. So again, I'm sorry, I sound like a broken record, but as you can imagine, I'm a big fan of specialization and complexity of technology. And that we are now beginning to see a sliver of.
Which is good news. But yeah, thanks. Okay, last couple of questions, Dr. Varma. One is on the Indian multinationals in the truest sense, which depend a lot, yes, on the US, and the last 4 or 5 years haven't been particularly kind to them. A lot of people say that it's more like an FMCG business, rather the other businesses, the FMCG out there in the US, it's more commodity and follows cycles. Do you analyze these businesses? Do you believe that we may be at a cusp of a new cycle or something like that, or you don't quite like what they're doing per se?
I think the era of people just producing at a lower cost and being able to sell in developed markets is over. Again, you need to find yourself a niche. So you take Ncube, which is another one of the world's largest topical companies, manufacturing in India, but almost 30% of our share goes into the US and the developed markets. It's quite clear that you have to fight this battle on technology, a specialized product, and then your ability to produce cheaply. So it's not just going to happen in isolation. Also remember that the US market is going through a seismic change. There are limited buyers. They control most of the market. There is this now push to drive prices down because even the US, it's very hard to sell at the kind of margins that exist. So a new kind of pharma animal out of India is going to come through. Produce cheap, produce high quality, and have a distribution network in the US by which you can penetrate. It will not just be done by producing cheap and upsell. It won't work anymore. So again, we are encouraging our companies to get more and more into specialized pharma products rather than providing mass benefit.
Aside of your companies, Dr. Varma, do you think the other Indian companies which are present there, are they taking some baby steps towards the model that you're talking about, or is it still some time away? You're not
No,
hearing...
I think it's been a brutal 2 years of reckoning for most large Indian pharma, which has succeeded well in the US. And I'm again beginning to see a pivot from the larger pharma companies to see what products, which niche ones that they can use to now penetrate the market instead of just trying to sell volume. So it is not just about volume, it is also about efficiency and savviness of the products.
Got it. My final question, Dr. Varma, what have been the recent portfolio entries or exits? And I mean, I don't really want to get into the names per se if you don't want to, but the whole idea is whatever recently that you may have done in the last 6 months, was there a sectoral reason or a theme reason why you took that call, or whether the entry or the exit, or were those very bottom-up company-specific calls?
No, services continues to do very well for us. So hospital plays, diagnostic plays does very well. Life sciences continues to do very well, whether it's in the CDMO space or the specialized API space. Clearly, digital initiatives in medicine, so health tech, such as companies like MediBuddy, which is in the corporate remote providing space along with drugs and diagnostics, that's a good area. And as I mentioned to you, medical equipment and indigenization of medical equipment for not just the market in India, but other emerging markets is a dominant theme.
Well, thank you, Dr. Varma. Always a pleasure talking to you. Thanks for your insights. Much, much appreciate. And have a great remainder of the year. Hope to talk to you towards the end of the year.
Thank you very much. Every time that we speak, something new comes up. So appreciate the time on your show.
No, thank you so much. And the pleasure is entirely mine and for our viewers too. Viewers, thanks for tuning in.